All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 19, The Atlantic System in Africa, 1550 to 1800. We'll be looking at Section 1, Plantations in the West Indies. So, Chapter 19, The Atlantic System. This is a term used to describe the system of trade surrounding the Atlantic Ocean. A lot of this was a result, of course, of the discovery of the New World and the type of economic system that developed in that particular region. So if we have a very crudely drawn map here, again, this is not going to be winning any art awards, but generally speaking, you should be able to kind of see what's going on here. That's North and South America. On this side, we've got Europe, the boot in Italy, the Mediterranean Ocean, which makes up the northern part of Africa. And then Europe here, you got France. And of course, you got some Scandinavian countries up here. And then we'll draw England right off the island. So this body of water is the Atlantic Ocean. Here we have Africa. Here we have Europe. And here we have the New World, which is, at this point, at least by 1550, and a little bit later on, certainly by 1600, 1650, is colonized by various European countries. So the Spanish have control over South America, also over Mexico. In Brazil, this is controlled by Portugal. In the 13 colonies, England controls this coast. And prior to the 7 Years' War, also France. Maybe France more right here is more accurate. And so this Atlantic system is in reference to kind of how this system of exchange and trade, it also might include the various sort of societies that emerge around this ocean. And that's more or less the focus of this chapter. Now, this section is looking specifically at plantations in the West Indies. The West Indies are the Caribbean islands, and we'll make maybe mark a different color to kind of show that here. The Caribbean islands are these islands right off the coast of Florida. It includes Cuba, but there's also various other islands. So that's what we're focused on in this chapter, just those small little islands right there. And plantations, a plantation is a sort of system to produce cash crops. In other words, it's a system in which the only goal of the plantation is to plant one single commodity. In this case, it's going to be both tobacco and sugar, and the purpose is to export that. So many of these islands here were exporting cash crops, tobacco and sugar, for most of this time period here, 1550 to 1800. So initially, on a lot of those islands, tobacco was a crop that was grown. However, sugar proved to be more lucrative. So we might say about this, sugar was more profitable. So even though tobacco was grown early on some of these islands, certainly by the 1700s, sugar is the dominant crop grown there. Also the system of labor. Now recall that we defined this term in a previous chapter, an indentured servant. We might call them a contractual slave. An indentured servant is required to work in slave-like conditions for anywhere between 7, 8, 9 years. In the Caribbean, indentured servants were typically contracted to maybe 2, 3, 4 years, so a little bit shorter of service. All these indentured servants were later on replaced by African slaves whose condition was permanent. And again, this transition from indentured servitude to African slavery was because the bottom line was simply more profitable. And so certainly our focus on these Caribbean islands wants to be with sugar plantations using African slavery, because that's eventually what they really comes to characterize them. Now, the way in which these various sugar plantations were financed and run essentially was through chartered companies. So a chartered company is a company. It could be a joint stock company, which we've talked about previously. But to be chartered means that the government grants special privileges to a particular company. Sometimes these are referred to also as royal charters in the case of countries which have a king or queen, which essentially grants that company special rules, privileges. One of the common privileges that might be granted to a company would be the privilege of monopoly, essentially meaning that that company who is growing sugar in the West Indies would be the only one legally permitted to from that various country. This was an alliance between government, royal authorities, and business. As long as the company returned money and paid taxes to the king or queen, these special privileges were kept up. And so that's how many of these things were financed. Initially, the first country to bring this system to the West Indies was Portugal. The first sugar plantations and African slaves arrived via Portuguese ships. So we might say that Portugal was the first to bring and we'll use this term, plantation system. And in addition to the West Indies, Portugal also brought this system to Brazil, which was one of its colonial possessions. So the way that the Portuguese did this was initially in the 1400s. Portugal had established sugar plantations in Africa. There's some islands here off the west coast of Africa. And so sugar plantations using African slaves were used here after the discovery of the New World and the discovery that the climate in the West Indies and the climate of Brazil is rather conducive to sugar growing. This system was thus brought over to the New World and really flourished in this particular area. However, the Portuguese did have competition. We had mentioned previously that the Portuguese were one of the first countries to engage in the age of exploration. However, they had challenges. The Dutch West India Company, which of course is Dutch, so that is the country of the Netherlands, quickly challenged Portuguese possessions in the Atlantic. The Dutch West India Company fought Portugal, and at least for a temporary time, took Portuguese sugar plantations. Also took over Portuguese African slave trade. So this was a European rivalry that played out in the Atlantic world. Even places like Brazil temporarily came under Dutch control. However, Brazil would be taken back by the Portuguese. There were other various islands in the West Indies which the Dutch and other European countries frequently fought over. One place that remained in permanent Dutch control was Elmina. This was an African trading city. Had served as a gateway for a long time into this Atlantic world. Elmina would have been located somewhere right here in Western Africa. So the Dutch certainly were part of the African slave trade as well, taking over a lot of it from the Portuguese. A little bit later on, we could say the Portuguese controlled the African slave trade maybe in the 1500s, the Dutch in the 1600s. Later on, it would be Britain, which would control most of it in the 1700s. By the 1800s, it begins to die down a little bit. And so we really want to put emphasis on this system here with sugar and slaves, including many West Indies islands, Brazil. So West Indies, we're talking about Barbados, Haiti is another good example, Jamaica, Cuba, right? All of these islands were really characterized by this same plantation system. 4 million slaves were brought to the Caribbean. To put that in perspective, compared to the British colonies, it was 10 times as many. And this illustration really does a good job in sort of focusing where exactly this system of slavery and sugar plantations is centered on. So you can see here, the red or pink represents those that were killed in transit. The voyage from Africa to the New World was called the Middle Passage, and it was incredibly deadly. Many people just died on the trip. The blue represents those that went to Spain. So at least early on in the 1500s, you can see that the Spanish mainland was a destination for many African slaves, but later on the Spanish fell behind in that regard. The yellow represents North America, a little here, a little here, a little here. But the most amount of African slaves were brought to the Caribbean and Brazil, and you can really see the growth from the 1600s to the 1700s, then to the late 1700s, which is where the system is primarily focused.